All right, so let's take a look at this first chorus here. So the first 4 bars in terms of the chord changes are exactly the same as our first blues and our first etude. Basically, we start with a 1, 4, B flat 7, back to the 1, and then the 4th bar is a 2-5 turnaround to the 4 chord in measure 5. So by a 2-5 turnaround, I mean the 2 C minor 7 is the 2 of the chord we're approaching, which is B flat 7. So if we're going to this B flat 7 chord, the 2-5 of that would be C minor 7, and F7 is the 5 of the B flat. So the F7 chord has kind of a duality. It's got a dual purpose in this song. It's the 1, it's the tonic, but it's also used as a 5 to get to the 4 chord because our ears are just accustomed to hearing that 2-5 turnaround. And, the 5 is always going to be dominant in quality. It could be unaltered, it could be altered depending on, where it's going and what you're feeling and what you're hearing at the moment. The 2 is almost always minor in quality, but it could also be dominant in quality if you're doing kind of like a cycle, a dominant chord cycle. But this is just a straight up 2-5-1 to B flat 7. So we have C minor 7, F7 to B flat 7. Now in measure 6, we have our first substitution, E flat 7. That's the flat 7-7 chord, meaning E flat is built on the flat 7 of the key. So sometimes people call that the backdoor chord, and it's a really nice sound to add to your blues progressions. It's a great change. And essentially what it's coming from in pop harmony is the 4 chord being major, and then the minor 4 going to the 1 major. So if you take the upper structure of a 4 minor 6, for example, B flat minor 6, but then you add an E flat, the flat 7 of the key, in the bass, now we have this nice dominant flavor built on the flat 7 of the key. So it sounds really nice, almost kind of like a gospel change from our 4 chord dominant to a flat 7-7 dominant, back home to 1. And then the next thing we see is a little chromatic turnaround. In the previous etude, we had the turnaround to G minor 7 just being a 2-5 of G minor. But now a variation on that is this nice chromatic, descending chromatic turnaround from the F7 going down in half steps to E7, another half step to E flat, which chromatically approaches the D7. Now we've arrived at the 5 of the G minor 7. So we've got this nice, and then 2-5, and then one final little turnaround at the end. 3, 6, 2, 5. Okay, so that's kind of the skeletal outline, the bone structure of the piece, if you will. So now we're just outlining those changes with our bass line. We're starting with our low F again, and we're chromatically approaching the 4 chord, the B flat 7, just like we did in the first etude. And we're adding some of these pull-offs to nowhere, such as in the second bar. So it's a real quick snap to A, and right onto the E flat. And again, it's just to approximate the sound of a drummer adding in an extra little kick on the 8th note or on a ride cymbal or a snare drum. Notice in the 4th bar, we have another one of these 8-note figures, but this time, instead of using the pull-off to nowhere, we're just using 2 actual notes and on 2 adjacent strings plucked with the right hand. So what we have in measure 4 is this. All right, so instead of using the pull-off to nowhere, we're going to actually pluck that last 8th note, the low F, but we're going to get right off it as soon as we pluck it. It's going to be, so we can make that short by releasing with our left hand index finger, and then we can also mute it with the right hand thumb. So that'll be, so we stop it right there and go right into the next note, B flat. Again, it's more about the feel than it is the pitches here. We just want to move this progression forward with our walking bass line. So the feel is, okay? Then we ascend to the E flat, another pull off to nowhere. and another one of these eighth note figures to drive it. Now, what's nice about this next two bars here is that we're moving down chromatically, so that doesn't give you a lot of space to move in terms of where you're going to, move around with your bass line. So with that said, it's okay to just repeat the notes. Bass players do this all the time, and that's actually a really cool effect that's created in the sound, because it's almost like they're just kind of stationary for a second, hovering, so that you're moving, and then you're just, staying there for a second, and then you're moving. And it creates this nice kind of push and pull or start and stop motion to the music, which makes it feel alive and organic, which is what we want. So at the risk of making it sound a little too boring, we can just add in these little eighth note kicks. And we do that on beats 1 of both of those measures. So we add the eighth note in the F, E, E flat, and then we can kick it into gear by approaching the G, and then we can move it again. Chromatically approach the turnaround. Now notice this very last note of the first 12 bars here. It's a low E. Now bass players, if you think about it, they only have 4 strings to work with, so they're using a lot of horizontal facility. And if they can get in an open string, they'll typically use it. And what that does is buy them some time to get into a new position. And that's what it's doing for us. So here we are. We're up in this area of the neck. We're kind of like an 8th or 9th position here almost. And what this does is buys us a quarter note's worth of time to get back down to first position to grab this next F13 chord that's going to kick off the next chorus of blues. So that's a really cool device that you can use, If there's a chord tone in your chord of the moment that happens to also be an open string and you need to change positions, that's a great little trick, great little device that you can use. So in this case, we're playing a C7, and E is the third of that chord. So we can play the root and then play that open, and that gives us a second to get ready for our F13 chord. And we do the exact same thing in that bar, the first measure of the second chorus, measure 13 in your PDF. We use the open A string to buy us a quarter note's worth of time to get up to this position for the C minor 7. So we've got this. So that open A string gives us the second to get up here. So that's a great little trick. So starting off on the first bar, measure 13 of the second chorus, it's... Now we're ready to play the rest of our chords. Okay, so everything that we're seeing up to this point has been covered in both the primer and in the first etude in terms of just playing chords both on and off the beat, or with and apart from the thumb. But now at the end of that fourth measure there, this would be measure 16, we see something new. We have an anticipation into the next chord. So we're using instead of using a 2-5, C minor 7 to F7 approaching the B flat 7 like we've done before, now we're using a nice substitution called a tritone substitution, which is just moving down chromatically. So we've got a C minor 7, and then that moves chromatically down a half step to B7, which is the so-called tritone sub of F7. And if you look at those chords, they're actually totally connected. They have the same DNA, if you will. F7 is this. We have F, A, and E flat. B7 is this. The A and the E flat or D sharp are both integral tones to both chords. And those tones are the guide tones of a dominant 7th chord. They are the intervals of a tritone, and also B and F are both in the intervals of tritones. So that's why it's called a tritone substitution. That's the lengthy definition of it. The quick and easy definition of a tritone sub is it's just simply replacing the 5 chord with another dominant 7th chord a half step above where you're going. And that's really easy to see in the fretboard. So if we're starting out with our 2 chords, C minor 7, we just go down a half step and play a dominant chord, approach the next chord chromatically. And that chromatic motion gives a real nice smooth flavor, and bass players love doing this. They're constantly throwing in tritone subs. So looking at that measure again, we have the C minor 7, we're voicing it as a C minor 11, and then we're playing the B7 as a B13, and then going into the B flat 7. And again, that gives us kind of like a nice little melodic figure on top. We've got this kind of foundational blues sound there. Embedded, that melody is embedded within the chords. You've got a little counterpoint, contrary motion, blues feel, tritone sub. There's a lot of nice little things, nice little Easter eggs going on in that bar there. And then getting back to the anticipation, and anticipation basically means to anticipate a chord or play the chord a half a beat earlier. So what we're doing is anticipating that B flat 7 chord in measure 17 by playing that on the and of 4 in measure 16. So that's just a matter of your right hand is going to do the same thing, play 2/8 notes successively. However, your left hand needs to change chords. So you need to do this all on beat 4. So that whole move is, starting from the B13, is both thumb and claw, and then just the claw on the new chord, B flat 7, followed by the thumb right on the downbeat of the next measure, and then followed right up on the and of that first beat with another claw. So the whole thing again is and then we move down chromatically and back up to the B flat 13 via an A13. Now, if you played it that A13, just for example, this is a little thought on chromatic approach. If you were to play this A13 out of context, it doesn't really sound like it has anything to do with the B flat 13. But if you're approaching it in time chromatically, then it actually sounds really nice. So don't worry that the notes of A13 aren't, in the key of F or whatever key you're working in. It doesn't matter. It's just about creating forward motion and the sound that you want to create. So in time, this sounds really nice. It's in the same way that we can approach, use the chromatic approach with bass lines, we can also do that with chords. And you don't have to worry about finding the right chord. A lot of times constant structure will work. So since we're moving into a B flat 13, the constant structure would be, just use that A13 down a half step and move right up into it. Okay? So from the beginning of measure 17, we have this. It's a nice little flavor that you can add in there. And we do the exact same thing at the end of that bar by chromatically approaching the F7 back to our tonic home bass with a G flat 13 chord a half step above. And you notice the top notes of those two chord voicings, again, are nice, like a nice blues type of thing. So earlier we had this, and then down here we have this. And those are just sort of embedded within the chord voicings. So you're adding melodies not only in your bass line, the little melodic arcs that you're creating, but you also can add little melodic figures in your comping as well, which I think is a nice way to thread through the progression. All right, everything else that we've seen so far, until we get to the end of measure 20, on the last beat of 20, we have a new triplet rhythm. Now, bass players love to do triplet rhythms, and they do that in a variety of ways. But since we're playing a bass note and a chord, we can create a triplet pattern alternating between bass, chord, bass. So we're looking at the A flat 13 chord now on the fourth beat of measure 20. And if we were to break that up, it would be bass, chord, bass. And that's all we're doing is just bass, chord, bass in a triplet rhythm. Triplet, 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 triplet. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can articulate this with the right hand. You can do a downstroke with your thumb, followed by the claw, and then another downstroke. Or you could experiment with doing an upstroke with the thumb. And this is something that I do just because it feels natural after a long time of doing this. And that is down, claw, up. And the reason why I do that is just to prepare my thumb to play another downstroke. But it doesn't matter. You can do, all consecutive downstrokes. But one thing that you may want to explore is trying to do a down, claw, up, down into the next chord. So that whole measure, bar 20, would be like this. Sorry. Another anticipation to the A minor chord. We're now in measure 23. And then finally resolve home with the F13, and we're using the pinky again, just like we did in the previous etude, to get a nice full-bodied 5-note chord voicing to end this off with. So we start off with a C13 sus, and then a C13 flat 9, and we can use a low E in there because we don't have a finger to we could play the C in the bass, but that would be kind of uncomfortable to do in time, so why not just let the root go and play another chord tone, that low E, and then now you have a nice contrary motion created by the chord going down to C13 flat 9, moving down to F13, and the bass moving up E to F. So now together we have this. So those last 4 bars again are 2, 3, and